Welcome back into the We Shall Not Sleep podcast. Thank you so much for joining us once again this week. We are finally back to a normal schedule. I really appreciate all the patience you have all had with our shakeups the last few weeks because we've had to reschedule so many of these interviews that I know you all have been really fond of and have grown accustomed to hearing on a regular basis. So tonight, we are back to it. Thank you so much. And I know that you'll appreciate the guest, but before all that, to get some of our formalities out of the way, I have to remind you that if you ever want to contact the show with suggestions, feedback, criticisms, anything, I don't care. It's wsnspodcast@gmail.com. In addition to that, please feel free to connect with us on our Facebook page. And we are found on SoundCloud where we're hosted. Shout out to them. We really appreciate it. And you can find us on our YouTube channel, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. Okay, so our guest tonight is Dr. Alan Knight from Spring Arbor University. He has a Ph.D. in Business Administration from Anderson University and an MBA from my alma mater, Olivet Nazarene University. He started his tenure in 2008 with Spring Arbor. He has years of business experience and leadership with publishing, such as Baker and Taylor Distributors, InterVarsity Press, and then Spring Arbor Distributors. Him and his wife have 2 kids together, a wonderful family, and for him, this is kind of it's a passion for him, but he enjoys a wide variety of interests, including business, obviously history, theology, philosophy. You will just love his passion, and I really appreciate his not just perspective, but his willingness to come and be a part of this podcast. So without further ado, here is Dr. Alan Knight. All right, well, Dr. Knight, thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's been very great to have gotten to know you over the last several years. I think my father introduced us on a lunch several years ago, and for whatever reason, which I think some people will find out, he keeps talking about you like you're a good guy. So I figured I'd have to, not just trust and verify. I have to go that second step.
Sure.
And to see how my dad came to that conclusion.
Great.
So,
well, thanks, Michael. I'm very glad to be here.
yeah, and I think one of the things that when we had breakfast about a month ago is something that we talked about, if you want to dare call it a pre-production meeting, was just
Yes.
kind of getting a feel of where each other have been in life, because that's the first time I ever had a one-on-one conversation with you.
That's right.
But just knowing the fact we're both Christians, you're in business, but you've traveled, you've been able to experience things that I haven't. And I think having your voice, your experience, your education is it's going to be very helpful for a lot of people out there, including like personal friends of mine, not just people I don't know. So as I ask of everybody when they come on this show, I have to, because it's such a precious thing, is as a fellow Christian, I have to ask, what was your come to Jesus moment? How did you become a Christian? What was that moment like for you, or how was the lead up for that?
Well, it's interesting you ask the question in that specific way. I wouldn't say that it was a moment necessarily. It was sort of a process in the sense that my mother and dad were believers, and so I didn't know of a situation where I wasn't going to Sunday school. I mean, that's my earliest memory. They're one of them, going to church and being involved in the class. I went to the Dana First Methodist Church in Dana, Indiana. Okay,
All right.
A thriving city of about 650 people. So, but my mother read to me and shared with me. Most of the people out there in your audience aren't going to know about Ergemeyer's Bible stories, but the Church of God Anderson published a book, a Bible story book for young readers, basically. And my mother used to read. I've still got it at home, and I think it's probably close to, well, I know it's got to be over 70. It's probably an 80-year-old book at home, but that's, I was fascinated by the Bible stories. And so as I got older, my folks said, well, Alan, we would like for you to begin to go to a Church of Christ. They both came to their faith and then were baptized, accepted Christ, were baptized in a Church of Christ, which don't know much you know about Methodism necessarily, but um, my folks believed in full immersion
Sure.
and adult baptism. So I started visiting this other church, Ridge Farm, Illinois, which isn't nobody's going to know where that is, but I was really impressed with the preaching, but I was traveled with the preacher a couple times, and he had a little lesson book, and I'm sure lots of preachers, evangelists, whatever, have a similar document. Oh, you're interested in learning about Jesus. Here's a sort of a workbook to work through, and so I worked through that, and I believe, and I don't remember if I was exactly 12 or 13. I should know, but it was on. It was a day that my birthday, which was April the 14th, fell on Easter Day. So I came to Christ in an evening service, a Sunday evening service, at the Ridge Farm Church of Christ. Many years ago, and so I have. Boy, I don't know if I want to say I've walked with Christ. Sometimes I've walked with Christ. Sometimes I've crawled to Christ. Sometimes I've turned my back on Jesus, and yet I've as I look back now, I'm not a young guy like you are. I turned 70 in April, and I began to see patterns. Okay, even when I was in the 6th and 7th, 5th grade, possibly. And I believe that God had a purpose for us. And that may have come very well from, not only just reading Scripture, but also from my mother's direction. And my dad was a believer, very much so, but most of that training or learning came from my mom. And so I really always felt there was a purpose, but that on a continuum, that purpose of life, as I got older and went through high school, I wanted to see if, I really wanted to be rich, wanted to have a lot of money, wanted to be a millionaire, which in those days was a lot of money. Well, it's still a lot of money by some reckoning.
Yeah, I heard they don't make as good as yachts as they used to.
No, they don't. So, but at the same time, I had a call that I felt was an audible call, and that to some sort of a profession or some sort of a life commitment. And I didn't have it all formed out like I do today, but I just remember I woke up one morning and I said to my mother, God wants me to be a doctor, a medical doctor. And so that was the focus of my educational pursuit, even in middle school and high school. I knew that I needed to get prepared. So, people don't take Latin anymore. They don't even offer it. But I had, Latin, 2 years of Latin in high school, a year of French. Anyway, all that to say, I was, every science course I could take in high school. And then I went to college. I went to several colleges, but my first college was specialized in pre-med education, liberal arts education. And I'll try to speed this up because I like to talk. But bottom line is, by my sophomore year, I realized this wasn't going to work. I wasn't cutting it. And that was a real devastation. Also, at the same time, I was pretty serious about a young lady, and that fell apart. And so that was a real low point.
Sure, I can imagine.
In my life then. And up to that point, I'd had a pretty fun time with summer jobs and so forth. My first summer out of high school, I worked at Mount Rushmore in sales.
Oh my, in sales?
Yeah, I worked at the part of the shop, and tourists would come in, but we sold Native American art and jewelry and pottery, and it was fabulous. I got to meet some really wonderful people that summer. And I was only 18. Then the next 2 summers, because I met somebody from a major bus company who happened to be a tour director, I said, I want to do that. And she's told me, says, well, here's the guy you need to call in Washington, D.C. So the next 2 summers, I was a tour director, and I usually took anywhere from 35 to 42 passengers from New York City or Washington, D.C. out to the West Coast and back. They were 30-day tours. So that was a summer job. So I think it gave me a great experience, right, Michael?
No kidding. That I almost want to hear more about that. How So you would go from East Coast to West Coast as a tour. Would you be driving it, or would
No,
you
I
be
had a
the?
driver.
Okay.
So my job was, to wear a double-breasted sport coat and a tie and a pair of slacks, wear my Continental Trailways pin, which I still have, walk up and down the aisles, keep people happy,
Right.
talk to them about the next stop or what we're
Sure.
going to do. And so, we'd start out from Port Authority Bus Terminal in New York City, um, and for a lot of people, it was their first time crossing
Oh yeah, of
the
course.
Hudson River. I mean, they had never been into
Right.
America, the main part of America. And so for the next 30 days, and we traveled to the West Coast and sort of via a more southern route, and then came back a more northern route. So, people got to visit, you know, um, Pittsburgh and the Golden Triangle and Indianapolis, and I could go on and on. But every day it was another
Yeah, I mean
destination.
that's
And
hitting the majority of the continental United
oh,
States.
it
I
really
mean,
did. I mean, we just didn't go into the deep south
sure.
from those trips. I mean, I did take a couple trips into the deep south, but mostly I like those California tours. So
Yeah.
so they were a lot of fun and met a lot of wonderful people. And
I bet.
I was just a kid, I mean, most of the people were from say 40 to 80,
Hmm.
and so here's this little upstart kid. What's he doing? How
Yeah.
does he know? Well, the trick was my mother and dad were members of AAA, and I just got a series of the AAA books. I don't know, you probably don't even know what I'm talking
No,
about,
well,
but
it's for car insurance.
no, it
I
was
was,
car. Well,
yeah.
actually, they were travel
Oh, they were
guides,
travel guy. Okay.
and you could get them by state or regions, and I would just look ahead for this next town coming up.
Oh,
I'd
that's
quickly
awesome.
read, the description. And I mean, I knew something about U.S. geography, but I could, well, we're coming up on, Concord, Michigan,
Yeah.
and blah blah blah, and so it was a very exciting summer job, and I got paid about three times an hourly wage of what it would have been to work on the roads, which a lot of young men worked on the roads in between
Sure.
college.
I would imagine some of those included tips at some point
Oh yeah,
too.
well I got tips at the end of the trip.
Oh
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
the reason why I almost light up when you say that is because for the last 2 years when I was at Olivet, which we share as an alma mater, which
yes,
we'll talk about in a moment, I did a trip not as extravagant nor not nearly as long, but I was hired as a student worker to go and be a part of what they call their primetime trips, where the
mm,
older alumni would go on a
mm,
trip, two tour
mm,
buses go somewhere for a
okay,
week, and they would ask the students to just go through the aisles, make sure they collect trash, hand out food, ask everyone's okay, and we would be in charge of carrying all the luggage. So the seniors would get off the bus; they didn't have to worry about anything.
right,
Um,
exactly,
so
yeah,
that was now we weren't the tour guides, but we basically just managed all the logistics.
right,
So any of the shows we went to, any of the
sure,
tourists, we would make sure we're just constantly with them, giving out water, making sure they're okay, and then also spending time with them, hearing from them, asking about their Olivet story. That's Olivet Nazarene University
sure,
for those
sure,
who want to know. That's something that I loved, and I had an opportunity to go on two of those. So when you say that, like that
okay,
sounds like a dream because we all got tips at the end of it
sure.
too. So that was really really cool. I didn't know that was part of your
Well,
job training. That's
yeah,
really
I
awesome.
got, we could talk about firefighting and chauffeuring ambulances and all kinds of
Yeah.
stuff. But I've kind of lived my life that if there's an opportunity, try to take it. And,
Yeah.
and so you build these experiences. And as I look back, I have to pause though and say, I'll bet one thing you didn't do with the Olivet trips was roulette. Yeah,
Prob
we
no,
we
that was.
did tire roulette. So
Oh,
we'd have
okay.
a piece of chalk, and people would mark a spot on the tire, the front right tire as
Mm-hmm.
they were getting on board, put their initials on it, and then I don't forget what they like $1 in the pot or something,
Okay.
And then we stopped for lunch. We'd see, whose name and mark was at the top of the arc on the wheel, and they won. So
Wow.
yeah,
Now that's creative. I haven't
yeah.
heard of that before.
Yeah, but that's not to say I'm a gambler, but I mean that
Oh,
was
sure.
that was
No,
just, yeah.
we if that was happening, that was in a dark room somewhere as like a quote unquote black market trading
Yeah,
on
right.
those trips. Um, the so you actually just began to talk about your education
Yes.
history when you were a sophomore and kind of going through that little bit of a crisis mode. Did you continue with that college? I'm just curious. How
No, I
did
didn't
you?
actually.
Okay, because I know you got your BS at Milligan, is
I
that,
did.
and
That is
then you went to
correct.
Olivet and then to
Anderson.
and Anderson. So how do you trace that journey then?
Well, At the time, I decided I'd just go down to Indiana State. I was at Wabash College. It was an excellent college, and I went down to Indiana State for my spring sophomore semester, and I basically just blew it off. I mean, I did a horrible job. I mean, I flunked a couple of courses, but I did get really good at bid euchre. I played bid euchre most nights from about 11 to 4. And so I understand students today, I mean, and so ultimately, again, my mom, God bless her, she realized, I needed to get my act together, and she wasn't real forceful about it. But we had our preacher at that time, Lucian Robinson, was at Woodland Heights Christian Church in Crawfordsville, and he'd graduated from Milligan. And I think she talked with him, and he said, well, you ought to take Alan down to Milligan and visit it, which we did that spring of my sophomore year. And I fell in love with the campus. It's in eastern Tennessee. It's in the foothills of the Appalachians. It's just it's a perfect place to be a college student, in my estimation. And so I ended up going there my junior and senior year, but I also changed majors from pre-med biology concentration to business administration. And that sounds like a huge change. It is a huge change. And I always, I felt like, oh my goodness, what about this call the Lord's placed on me? So, I brought a business in between my junior and senior year in a little town in Indiana, finished my undergrad course, moved to Greencastle, spent a few years there with this business, then moved on closer to Indianapolis, Indiana, and had a business reversal. And so ultimately ended up getting a job up in Illinois. And so it was, I moved from sort of financial services to businesses, which is what the little business was that I owned, and a company that was a book distributor hired me.
Okay, yeah.
And the name of the company was Baker and Taylor, and their plant was in Momence, Illinois, which is, not too far from
Right, yeah.
from Olivet and Kankakee.
Almost a second home.
Yeah. So I moved, lived in Bourbonnais. I'm pronouncing that right. So
Yes, you are.
now, for those of you out there in the audience, you probably don't know that if you live in that part, you have to say the village is Bourbonnais, the township is Bourbonis.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
That is right.
Which is really interesting because, it doesn't matter. But it's those little things, idiosyncrasies you learn about areas, which I think makes part of living in different places fascinating.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, adds to it.
So I worked from 1980 to 1987 at Baker and Taylor, and I was a director over the purchasing. So we were at that time, I don't know, $75, $80 million business, and I had a department of about 25, 30 people worked with me. So I oversaw all the book purchasing, so that part of the supply chain, as well as the non-book purchasing. I began to realize, I was walking, around, which I did a lot. I'm one of these. Have you ever heard of the term MBWA? MBWA. It's called management by walking around.
Oh, okay.
I still think that's a critical thing. MBWA, and too few leaders, managers, executives do that today. You want to get to know what's going on, because it's the folks that are making it happen out there, the frontline folks. Those are the people you want to talk to.
Yeah, that's right.
And so you can't do that if you're in an office and sitting in a meeting. You need to get up and get out, greet people, let them know that you appreciate what they're doing. Maybe they tell you hey, my child is sick, or don't know if I can make my car payment this month, or whatever. I mean, all those things are important. And we don't have a lifetime where I could tell you why I think that folds into what it means to run a business in a manner that reflects both servanthood and stewardship, which are terms that have grown on me more recently than back in the 80s when I was at Baker and Taylor. So I also realized that I needed to go back to college. I didn't feel like I had the requisite information and hadn't connected the dots that I needed to do, and so I decided to go for the Masters of Business Administration program, which was offered at Olivet Nazarene.
Yeah.
So I sort of cleared the path for you in later years.
I
You know.
really appreciate that. Yes, so I was taught everything I know by your mistakes and your
Yeah,
failures.
exactly.
But I also, because of that, didn't have as much fun at Olivet because they instituted all those rules.
Yeah, well,
After you
I
left.
could tell you about some. I used to, when I went to church. Well, I did go to church after I moved. That's a whole different story. But um, so the fact was that then I also changed. I moved from Baker and Taylor to InterVarsity Press, which is an arm of
Mm.
InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and I became their marketing and sales director. So I managed the marketing and sales for InterVarsity Press for about 3 years. It was an exciting time. I mean, I got to meet, actually, John Stott. Again, a lot of people may not know who he is, but at one time, um, he wrote a book called The Cross of Christ, which is very popular in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And he was also the Queen Elizabeth's personal chaplain for a long time.
Mm.
And uh, InterVarsity Press really introduced me to authors and thinkers that had come out of, in some cases, uh, the Oxford movement, in other cases, um, Anglicans who had sort of had a renewal kind of experience. And so there's a number of really fantastic authors. Maybe, again, some of your audience may not know, but if you get a chance, you should go to InterVarsity Press's website and see some of the backlist books that they have, as well as the new things. I think they're one of the most, in my opinion, uh, credible Christian publishers for the person who hungers to be challenged spiritually. And so, anyway, I was there for 3 years, and then I was hired um, by Spring Arbor Distributors, not to be confused with Spring Arbor University, Spring Arbor Distributors, to take over and manage the purchasing here in Michigan at their Belleville corporate headquarters, Belleville, Michigan. And so I was there a few years, and the president came to me one day, and actually I think he was still vice president at the time. He said, Alan, he says, we think you could do better for us in business development work. So I'd had some history in doing that. When I was at Baker and Taylor, for instance, I helped develop the first religious products catalog that company had, and we served probably 25,000 between libraries, academic libraries, and retailers. And then when I came to Spring Arbor, they decided, well, why don't you go out and help, do some business development. I was a vice president. So basically, I went out and we provided services to smaller publishers
Mm-hmm.
who didn't want to fuss with their own inventory, who realized that working the back office parts of publishing was very costly, especially in times in terms of focus. Wait, I'm a publisher. I'm trying to find authors and publish them. But wait a minute, somebody just ran in from the warehouse to say, "Oh my gosh, a skid turned over. What am I supposed to do?"
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So what we did is we could come in and say, "We'll take over your distribution." And then the second thing that we did at Spring Arbor was we collected money. We were basically the first vendor to get paid, because for a retailer at that time, if a publisher cut them off because they couldn't pay the bill, they could come to Spring Arbor and get the same book. Now, they didn't get it quite at the same discount. So we were, a provider who got paid before pretty much anybody else. It was an interesting dynamic. So, publishers began to come to us. I spent a lot of years on the road. I was in the air quite a bit, sometimes 3-4 days a week. And, it's nice being platinum with Northwest Airlines.
Yeah.
So Northwest Airlines doesn't exist anymore, but, I traveled not much internationally, mostly West Coast to the South and to the East Coast. So I had clients in Alabama and Texas and Arkansas and California and Colorado and Illinois and
Just
New
terrible
York.
places to travel to.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you have to have dinner in New York City and put it on your expense tab. And
Right.
but My boss was very good to me. He was a road warrior as well. And if you're going to be a road warrior, you want to have a boss that's a road warrior
You understand.
because they understand the
Yeah.
vagaries of
Of course.
travel and everything.
So with doing this, you ended up eventually your way to Spring Arbor University where we met. So
Right.
how did you end up at Spring Arbor University, and how did you know you wanted to get a Ph.D. in business administration? I mean, how does that journey
Well,
happen?
I think it's an ongoing spiritual journey because it was in that time frame from InterVarsity to um, Spring Arbor Distributors that I get introduced to the Book of Common Prayer.
Oh yes.
And the faith tradition that I grew up in, the focus was on the Lord's table, the Lord's Supper, Eucharist, okay, communion. And when I saw the beauty of the language in the prayer book, and I thought, holy smokes, we're not, we'd have these little devotionals, and I'm not knocking anything that people do. I'm just
Of
saying,
course.
from my perspective, and I thought, wow, there's this richness that goes back several hundred years, and so that sort of sent me on the journey, and my spiritual journey has been one of the things that concerned me in the Church of Christ, and I love it. I mean, it's also called the Stone Campbell movement. You may not have heard of it, but it goes back to roughly 1809 here in the United States. It was a movement in the U.S. And I felt like I had become such a good Christian. Those are air quotes for those of you who can't see. Uh, and I began to carve off people. Okay, well, they don't believe quite what I do. They're not worthy of my fellowship. I mean, that, to put it in the harshest terms I can. And I kept seeing that group of connections was getting smaller and smaller, and I came down to saying, well, Alan, maybe you're going to be the only real true Christian. And I just woke up and said, whoa, wait a minute, that can't be right. Something's wrong here. And I think coming back to my experience with InterVarsity and then meeting some of these other publishers from all these different backgrounds, I began to see, well, Christ's kingdom, first of all, I'm not the judge of what that's going to look like and who it's going to be. And my role is to share, Christ. And fast forward 10 years, I mean, sort of the culmination of that was, I went through a divorce and then remarried. And I'd always been so vehemently, I thought, I just condemned anybody that had those kinds of issues. And I still think, I'm not trying to make it seem less onerous or anything else, but that was sort of my wake-up moment. Then those things are converging. Okay, the Eucharist, okay.
Just like everybody else, right?
And then I wrote, Alan, you're just a sinner saved. I mean, I could articulate that, but then,
But having a heart knowledge
right,
of that, of full understanding,
yeah,
is
and
different.
so without getting too much in the biographical background, I've probably done too much now. I'm hoping to give some tidbits that maybe that people can hang on. Not that they're going to live my life, but that they can see that if they're experiencing similar conundrums, challenges, friction, disappointments, failures, and so forth. And so I had another business that failed, and I called, actually it was called Living Epistles. Some of you may know the Lord's Gym t-shirt, and my wife and I still own the rights to that t-shirt. And I talked to a friend of mine that I'd known as a business associate one evening, and he said, Alan, you know what? He said, I know your story. I know what you've been through. You know what I think? I think you should go back to university and get your doctorate and teach. And I said, Steve, that's just about the most idiotic, crazy thing anybody's ever told to me. But I said, because I have such respect for you, and I do. He's a wonderful man of God. I said, I will pray about it over the weekend. And by Monday morning, I knew that's what I was supposed to do, was to go back to grad school and leave the corporate world behind. I also do consulting, and I was making some pretty nice money consulting. With American Bible Society was one of my clients for a while, and other organizations. So went back to grad school, and that took me about 7 years to get through and defend my dissertation. So started in 2007, started teaching at Spring Arbor University in 2008, and then was hired full-time in 2009 or 10, and so I've been there ever since. But my focus is on, because I've worked with small businesses, I love entrepreneurial thinking. I love people who want to innovate, and how I've packaged all that up, at least in my thinking, is, I mentioned earlier, really our call as believers, is to serve others. And I think, may not be the only way, but I think that free markets, allowing people the choice, this idea of freedom, and then the other part of it is this idea of stewardship. So serving others, and then being a good steward, because I think maybe I mentioned this to you. God is creator. God created the universe, and what does it say in Genesis? God's greatest handiwork was humanity, right? Well, in doing that, God gave us creative talents, right? We were made in His image, right? So
Exactly. Yeah.
and so as I don't want to say fellow creators, but creators after His image, each one of us has some kind of a gift. God's gifted us, and we need to utilize that to advance God's work. Not everybody realizes that. I get that, but what I'm talking about now is developing this worldview over all this lifelong,
Sure.
and realizing that people have these gifts, and moving out of sort of the material realm. And I'm very much still, I got lots of material blessings, but I'm not. I don't make, I make less than a third of what I made when I was in my corporate life. But if I can impart that, see, that's where the university makes sense to me. To help these students see that, and to capture, maybe from my life journey, and I don't necessarily tell them all the things that I'm telling you, and I just realized you're recording it, aren't you?
Yeah,
No.
that's right. That's right.
So,
Cut.
yeah, there you go. So, the amazing thing, remember this common theme I mentioned, right? From I was a very young kid. God called me to be a doctor,
Yeah.
medical doctor.
Yeah.
And the assistant rector at my church at the time in Belleville was meeting with me and some of my business colleagues in 2006, I think, maybe, let's just call it that, 2006, because I was really troubled with what was going on with the business. I had my management team there. I asked her if she could come and join us in prayer, and she prayed over all of us. It was really interesting. She had us kneel, and she asked for our discernment over what God's call was. It was quite an interesting evening. And when we were done with that prayer time, she sat down around the table, and we were having some refreshment. And so she went around the table, and my son Eddie was there, who's a graphic designer, and going around the table, different, I think it was about 4 of us, 5 of us maybe. And she came and she says, "Well, Alan, what tell me a little bit about your background." And that's when I shared the story that I just shared here about the call to be a doctor. And she said, "Alan, did you ever think God called you to be a healer?" Now, I was 56 at the time. That was 40-some years since I thought God called me to be a medical doctor. And it probably took me to get to the appreciation of what the real call was, living out that life, right? And so where I find myself now, I mean, I always have been interested in other people, and if I can help them in some way, give them some counsel in some way. But now God has allowed me to be in a situation at a small university where we get to know our students, work with them sometimes up to 4 years, if they're in our major area, and encourage them on this idea of servanthood, stewardship, and the importance of commerce in helping improve people's lives. I don't think God has a problem with people eating healthily, and we just said, we have to be careful that doesn't become our God, right? The material thing.
Exactly. Yes.
So, to know I'm sending out in some small way, I'm not saying that, I'm the catalyst for every one of these students, but I'm part of a network of other faculty and professors, you see. And so I'm comfortable that this has been my life call. It just took me, from a few years to get there,
Yeah.
about 50 years.
Yeah, and I really do appreciate that passion, because, and you mentioned a little bit of the fundamentals that you yourself believe in, which I share a common understanding, even though I'm not a businessman myself. But one of my coworkers, who I'll give a shout out, who was my first guest on here, Mr. Michael Perry. He has two franchises of Big B Coffee here, and he also works at the same place I do at Lanier Incorporated, and he shared a lot of that perspective. And so I asked him a little bit about this too several months ago. But one of the things that I have to ask you, is the fact that, at least in our country, and this is again for those who potentially might be living outside the United States, you have an understanding that our churches here function as a business, and they have particular rights given to them that is granted to us by our government that puts us in a certain category of business, but they're still business. We still have things, we still have bills we have to pay in order to maintain a building, in order to have a space, versus other people who don't have to worry about that necessarily, because the church is either burned down, not there, or or they're meeting in secret. They don't have that type of
Sure.
burden. So I would say, if you are if you just broadly assessing the church in America, how do you think the business is doing? That's a very loaded question,
Well, it sure is, isn't it?
I asked that on purpose.
I, I think my biggest concern as I look out, and I was, I've watched, because of my involvement with publishing and the Christian music business and distribution.
Oh my, yeah, yeah.
I saw a lot of these various movements take off, take forward, and Calvary Chapel and Vineyard and so forth that 30 years ago, 40 years ago were pretty began, and there's several of those left, but they began a movement towards this mega church, and I have to say I think that's where the business model has gone awry, because it's so easy as a leader to get enamored with yourself,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
and look at the growth and measure it by numbers. And I think there's nothing wrong with having revenue that exceeds expenses. In fact, if you want to keep your doors open, I would argue that doesn't matter what you're doing.
Right.
Ultimately, that has to happen. But if that becomes the purpose, and it may be it's insidious, right? I mean, it comes in, and it's a little flash, and then it becomes a little flame, and then it grows into raging inferno. And I've just news, and I won't mention the person's name, a gentleman who was very popular on religious TV, probably 40 years ago, 50, yeah, at least 40, 45 years ago, went to prison, and which was some wrongdoing, and got out, started another church, and then just is getting charged with basically and I don't know if it's false advertising or not, but that's what the federal government has decided to do on some sort of treatment for a particular disease. I think it's easy, and again, I don't know the man's heart. I'm not saying anything about him. I'm not going to mention his name, as I said. However, there's a certain sense of genuineness that you can spot in people if you talk to them, get to know them. And I think the danger is even you look at so many of these people, like Willow Creek, for example. I don't know if you follow Willow Creek very closely.
Well, at least certainly being close to it in Olivet during those years, you become very aware of it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And so the question is, what's the drive? And I think the answer, at least in my mind, is this: that a lot of these mega churches succeed, and they follow a certain level of the marketing concept, which they may not understand that's what they're doing. But okay, I've got an audience out here, and I want to figure out how I can get them excited and interested in me. And I think what's happened with a lot of worship, and this is where if you will, the worship that goes way back even into the synagogue that became part of Christian worship, those elements, and then ultimately we see it in Catholicism and Anglicanism and Orthodoxy, and so who's being entertained?
Yeah. What are we there to do at church?
Right. So are we as parishioners, congregants sitting in the pews, the ones being entertained? And that's what I saw at Willow Creek. And again, I don't want to cast aspersions on Willow Creek, but I remember when I said, man,
Oh, go ahead. It's fine.
oh, this is fantastic. And I remember my two oldest kids were younger then, because that was in the 1980s, and they were just mesmerized by the tightness of the production. I mean, it was like going to Broadway.
Yeah, it's a concert.
Right.
And I think, you just touched upon this. It's motive. You're basically attacking motive. Motive. You can have a church that's growing,
Absolutely.
with its amount of people, and with the amount of income, tithing.
Right.
I mean, hopefully, if you're preaching the word and you're doing so in a particular community, the Holy Spirit can move and draw people together.
Absolutely.
Jesus drew people towards him. It was not the most popular message in the day.
No.
But he drew them there. So to an extent, I would love if my church grew.
Sure.
But I tell my people at my church, my congregants, that those people don't have to come to my church to be saved.
Right.
And because I know that there's other churches out there, believe it or not, that I don't attend, that are okay. Then I think that's the other thing that we don't like. We kind of get in this competition of like, well, if I
Yes.
talk to someone about the supermarket about my faith, and then they don't come to my church, and I've somehow failed because they haven't come to my church, because my church is the only way to heaven.
Right.
I had a professor at Olivet. I don't know if you remember the name or know the name, Dr. Mark Quanstrom.
I don't.
But he's the head pastor of College Church there, right on the campus, and he's also, at least at the time when I was there, the dean of the School of Theology. And he said in one of my upper level theology classes, my senior year, I'll never forget it. He said, sometimes the church that is preaching the gospel in its most pure form is the church that's losing people, because the truth is so difficult to hear. And he says the temptation for some pastors is that when you start looking at the finances and you look at who works for you and who you're accountable for, and they're your friends, and the board saying we're going to have to make some cuts, and the temptation, he goes, not all pastors, but it's like, so do I talk about divorce this Sunday, or do I give them a feel good message,
right,
just to keep them in the pews? And he's saying that, I'm not saying that so that we can excuse that behavior, but he was trying to get us young students, giving us the kind of the context of the temptation that awaits you, so you have an improper understanding, because it's so easy to say, they sold out because they're about themselves, which might be very true in the end.
Sure.
But the journey of getting there is not just because they're sinister necessarily.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's again, like I said earlier, it's insidious. I mean, it begins to, hey, that worked. Let me try something more. And it's interesting. And I'm not here to promote traditional Anglicanism. I'm not an Episcopalian. I'm an Anglican. I have been an Episcopalian. And our pastor, rector, if you will, at the beginning of the summer was going to teach, and did preach a series on Deuteronomy. Oh boy, didn't that sound exciting? Actually, it was very exciting. But what's interesting, and I don't know if you know about the liturgical churches, they follow a lectionary.
Yes, absolutely.
And so our parish follows a lectionary, and so he had to go outside the lectionary in order to do this. He had to go to the bishop and say, "Look, I want to do this series."
Yeah, exactly.
And the bishop had to give him permission, which I I mean, for some people go, well, how does the Spirit work now? Well, the Spirit worked, with our pastor. He felt like there was messages that in these sections of Deuteronomy, but he also demonstrated, authority, that he had an authority over him. And I was impressed by that, and sitting there, and I, any rate, it's an interesting model. I'm not saying it's the only model or the right model.
Right.
I think the right model is Jesus is king. That's the right model.
Right. Which is becoming more and more controversial as we have continued to go on. And, that's very difficult because in our society, you would think of, well, more, if you have more consumers and therefore more income, you're doing something right. But
Right.
when it comes to the Christian tradition and evaluating the business, Paul gives us a definition of, from Galatians chapter 5 about how if you're going to be a Christian, here's
Yes.
what here's
Yes.
what your faith should taste like. This
Yes.
fruit that we have, and it's that you can't put that on paper. You have to
Right.
live with people. You have to walk with people. You have to, like you were doing, much like you were talking about this walk around business management,
Right.
and also being with students. You're elbow to elbow with people. You're seeing them live out that faith.
That's
And
true. Yeah.
when you look at the thousands of followers of Jesus, which I find fascinating, thousands of followers. He had 12 disciples, and discipleship is so much different than followership
Yes.
from Jesus.
Yeah.
And one of those disciples completely betrayed him, and all of them fell away when he was crucified. So that's a little humbling for the rest of us.
Right.
And
And if it
and,
isn't, it
yeah,
should be, right?
yeah, and if and that's where I think too, from publishing, maybe you can, maybe this is a joke that I say this, but if I were to write a book, which I do want to write a book at some point here shortly. I've been working on one.
Oh, have you?
Yeah,
Good for you.
and if I want to publish it, and it's a Christian book, and it is like right in line. It does not violate the Apostles' Creed.
Sure.
It's completely orthodox, and it makes the New York Times bestseller. I'd be kind of nervous about that because the gospel message is not a popular thing,
right.
and I am not saying that someone's a heretic if they make the New York Times best-selling list. No, I'm just saying that inherently it's not going to be popular, but it seems as if, from my perspective, my short 27 years, that growing up in that environment, that, I mean, the height of Christian liberalism in the 90s, I mean, that was at the peak. That was and from my perspective, because at least after that you started to see the Catholic Church start to crack in the 2000s
yes.
with its scandals. You started to see a lot of the scandals from a lot of these megachurch pastors.
Right.
But the 90s, it had such a foothold in politics and power and sway that at least 20 years ago, it looks kind of ridiculous now, but it's still there. It's not like all these megachurches have closed. So
Right.
I guess my question to you is that I don't want those people to go away.
Right.
But is it, and you have to be able to check motive, but are we still, is there still something that we're still mixing up the fact that it's a business, but we're still marketing it like a business, unfortunately? I'm just.
Well, a few years ago, a gentleman by the name of Donald Miller out of Nashville started a program on. It's a way of marketing. The name will come to me in just a second. I had it just a second. And it's this idea. Story brand. I can't. And I think he's really onto something that can also be used for churches, and maybe it started. And that idea is it continues to turn the focus away from the self. And the concept of story brand is, let's imagine that I'm a congregation, and I can define pretty well, what areas that I not only can succeed in but excel in. Okay, and some people have great sermons, right? Others are pastors and healers. Others are organizers, and we know that the Scripture talks about these different gifts. So, but the idea behind story brand is, okay, if you've defined in your congregation what it is you think your strengths are, and then you say, okay, this, and here's where some people may go kind of crazy when they hear this. But all right, so what is my brand? Okay, what is the brand of the North Adams Church, right?
Right. Yeah.
And don't take that too far, but it says, okay, I can't do. I'm not Willow Creek. Okay, I'm not Holy Trinity Anglican Parish in Hillsdale. I'm North Adams. So, what do we have on offer here? And the story brand idea is basically you're searching for those people, be they seated in your church congregation, be they people you don't know, but we're in a logical service area. Think of them from the standpoint of story, and I have to get real careful if I get too into philosophy because I'll mess it up. But the idea of story as written about by Aristotle and so forth. There's a hero and a guide and an unresolved conflict. So the hero of the story, so of North Adams, is not the pastor.
No.
The hero is actually, now, bear in mind, Jesus is over all this, but is that member of your constituency who is lost. And I don't mean lost necessarily outside of Christ, but they have some sort of unresolved conflict. Maybe it's marital issues, maybe it's children's issues, maybe it's financial issues, whatever it might be. Maybe it's drug abuse. You are the guide. You and the other parishioners, the stronger parishioners, are the guide to help the person who's having those challenges seek reconciliation. And your mission and your ministry to them is to say, hey, Alan, you've come to me. I know you've got this issue. Let me help you find a resolution to it. And I think that perspective, I'm fascinated by that perspective. And I stumbled on lots of stuff. I read too much. But when I found that, I said, man, this helps make the whole idea of business and the marketing concept down into something that would really be embraced by Christians, by believers. Because, again, this goes back to what I'd already formulated was servanthood, right, and stewardship. And then to see Donald Miller's construct. And so that's what we work on in our classes, okay? What is it that is unresolved and can we define a constituency that we can help them with resolution because we are able to guide them to resolution. So what that says is I can't serve everybody. And we know that just by, right, because can Willow Creek, I know they've tried to do that, and I'm using Willow Creek as a general statement for all these mega churches,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
They try to break down into small groups, and some are very successful and some aren't, right? Because whoever's a senior pastor, he can't even begin to deal with 10,000 people, right? He doesn't even know all their names.
And you have 100 qualified leaders that are going to be teaching and have the same type of theological convictions.
Right.
Not that they have to, but it'd be nice that when you have a congregation, they're all learning the same type of thing about you name it as far as any sort of
Sure.
theological discipline. That's interesting. So again, hero, guide, and resolution.
Right. So the parishioner,
Sure.
the congregant, the person that's outside the church, is takes on the figure of the hero, and don't think about some of these big name heroes, like we might call David a hero under certain circumstances.
No, yeah, of course.
But that's the focus. Now, ideally we want to get them to come to realization, but we're there to serve them and help them resolve that conflict. It's not about, look at me as Alan Knight or look at you as Michael Crable. We're the stars of the show here. And of course, Jesus is the star. Jesus is the king. And I just began reading a book this summer, published in 2017. It's called Salvation by Allegiance, which ought to send some people up in arms when they read this guy's book. It's written by Matthew Bates, and it's a fantastic book. And I won't get into much of it, other than to say it's another step towards me sort of reconciling, some of these issues that I've thought about over the years. And basically all he says is, no, salvation is by grace, but the continuation of are we loyal to Jesus as King?
Yeah.
It's not just like
actions
right.
Be like.
And I think he really helps put it together. And he uses a Greek word, which, by the way, another scholar I was interested in 50 years ago used the same word in more or less the same context. So, and I've really had to think about that because I think it's easy for us. What is it when we, and I don't know, do you have communion in your congregation?
Yes, sir.
So, as we gather around the table and think about Christ, but see Christ, we follow through, right, with his, what's the mysteries of the faith? Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again, right? And so the reason Christ can come again is because Revelation tells you, Jesus is king. Jesus is on the throne.
Yes.
And I think it's easy for us to forget that, especially I'm somewhat a student of history, and you see the times we're in right now. It's scary.
Yeah.
Very scary.
Yeah.
And has it been scary before? Absolutely. We just haven't had access in the 1500s or
Right.
the thousands or
And-
the 800s
And
to the information.
And for this country, it's like once a generation where you kind of experience these times.
Sure.
And for me, where I'm standing, as an older millennial. Well, actually, I'm on the younger side of millennials now. Everything that's going on in the world still doesn't really affect me all that much.
Right.
It affects me indirectly through how other people are experiencing, and then they become how do they feel disenfranchised? Doesn't mean that is the most important thing, but I want to be able to know where people are at.
Right.
I mean, again, it's kind of the effective speech 101 of know your audience.
Oh, absolutely.
You bring up so many good points. We could
I apologize.
No, we can.
Maybe I'll
we
come
can-
back
no,
sometime.
Yeah, I love a part two. The reason why is because there's so many different branches here that we could go down. But I guess for me, when we look at not just we look at just the state of the church today, but I would almost want to talk about business because there was a gentleman who I've also had on this podcast that when he's involved in real estate now and he's achieved his goal. But when he was a freshman at Olivet, he told people his goal was to be a millionaire someday. And a lot of people, because he was taking ministry classes too, and
Sure.
a lot of us ministry people would be like, wait, isn't that kind of a bad thing? And there's this misnomer that if you have a lot of money,
Right.
or that if you make money, that somehow you're always going to be the rich young ruler that Jesus, rebukes about not being able to give their entire life to him, not being willing to risk everything to give
Sure,
everything
sure.
away, which is comical because that's just a complete judgmentalism. Now, I think for somebody as you and your experience, what are some of the misconceptions, misnomers that Christians have about businessmen, successful businessmen or businesses that either ally themselves with the Christian church or who are Christians themselves who
Right.
happen to make a lot of money? What are some things that we just get wrong
Well,
about all of that?
That's a great question. I'm somewhat a student of economics as well, and I tend to follow a particular arena. I won't get into it. I mean, it's called Austrian economics, but and it's really about free markets and freedom. I think the biggest challenge is people. Well, for example, and I have issues with Jeff Bezos more politically than I do with his success as a business person.
Sure. Yeah.
We can look at Jeff Bezos and say, well, this guy's got billions of dollars, and I don't have that. Well, the reason Jeff has billions of dollars is because he created, along with others, a business called Amazon and a lot of offshoots from that actually provide me with a great deal of convenience as well as you. I don't know if you buy anything from Amazon or not.
Absolutely.
All right, so one of the things that how wealth gets created for you and me, as well as for Jeff Bezos, is to lower transaction costs.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's exactly what's happened. Instead of me, I live in the idyllic town of Concord. So instead of me having to run into Jackson, though I did run into Jackson 3 times today, which didn't make me real happy. But no, running in to see you made me happy. Well, then running in to see my daughter.
Well,
made me,
we'll find out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any rate, so all that to say, but I can pick up a phone and in 2 days have a box right from Amazon, as opposed to running into Jackson. I don't mind running into Jackson. I'm just saying, but if you run low on it's just as economically beneficial to me. And then when I think about my opportunity cost or the cost of me running into Jackson and back if I don't want to because I have to pick up something, that's time that I could have been spent doing something else. Okay, so lowering transaction costs. That's exactly how Bill Gates made his money. He made it easier for people to communicate data and information through Microsoft, or we could talk about Apple. Okay, any of those big things. What about Henry Ford? What did Henry Ford do? He lowered the transaction costs of people owning an automobile. I think those are all great things. I think I have this right. When he hired his workers for his factories, he realized that they couldn't necessarily owned one of his vehicles. He said, I have to get the price of that vehicle down through efficiency and so on and so on, so that the average person who works for Ford Motor Company can buy a Model T. And I think at the time they were $365. So that's the beauty of the business. Now, what happens is when wealth can lead to hubris, okay, wealth can lead to saying, just because I'm good at one thing, I can be good at something else. So now all of a sudden, I'm a rich man and I can tell Michael, this is how I think you should live. That's where I have a problem with wealth. And that's what we're seeing, I think, today in the world from a lot of very wealthy, not all, but I mean, there's significant wealthy people who are combining with some of our political leaders. And again, I don't want to get into but
It's connected.
To begin to force people and reduce their freedom of choice. And I'm not talking about babies here.
Right.
That's not freedom of choice, first of all. But for me to be a consumer, which we all are consumers, right? So I think that's where people get confused. And the other thing that was never thought about this until several years ago is every economic transaction has two sides. If students come to me and say, well, how come so-and-so they can buy a Hummer and I can't, and how's that fair? And I said, well, did that Hummer just appear to just take his magic, or she take a magic wand, poof, there's a Hummer? No. They bought that Hummer. How did that Hummer get built? Yeah. Somebody had to build it. So wages were paid, and so I think we tend to focus too much, all of us, on ourself and not consider, and I don't want to make it too, we don't have to get too complicated about it, but it involves so many other things, and again, being able to go out and buy something, it looks to me like you get your water from the water store.
Yep. Yes, I
So
do.
somebody delivers it, right?
No, I pick it up.
Oh, do you?
Yes, I do. I go there and I pick it up. But let's say, for the example, that I did have it delivered here.
Well, okay, that's fine. But I mean, so someone has a job because you want to have a 5-gallon bottle of water.
Yep, that's correct.
You see, or if you drive to get it, you buy gas. How many workers have been involved in getting that gasoline into your car? I grant you that. You're probably self-filled the vehicle, but before that, who knows how many hundreds of people have had some hand in.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think we tend to lose sight of that.
So we just see the end number, and it's like they have it, I don't, and
Right.
therefore it's wrong.
Right.
And it's also, I think it's a judgment on the fact that we talk about stewardship, that like every wealthy person either did it for the sake of being wealthy, and that's all they care about, or that once they have this wealth, they can't be good stewards of it.
Right.
Because God forbid that there might be somebody out there that God has blessed that's actually really good at handling money and
Certainly.
making sure it gets placed and for a good and holy cause
Sure.
versus just self-indulgence. I think we kind
Right.
of like, well, they must be successful, so they must be selling out their soul somewhere.
Right.
Because majority of Christians are not millionaires, so therefore, if somebody's a millionaire in the room, then they're doing something wrong or they're
Right.
worshiping their money. And that, I mean, how sinister is that?
Well, absolutely, and I've been an entrepreneur, still sort of am, and I've worked with entrepreneurs a good part of my career, and I teach entrepreneurship, and I think the thing is that there are specifics that we can help people understand they need to do in order to be a successful entrepreneur, but that is only a small part of their being successful. Some of it's the vagaries of what's going on around them, right? I mean, how many people had an idea of selling books online and well, CBD for one, Christian Book Distributors. Do you ever buy a book from CBD?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Well, they're not Amazon, and they were doing books by mail probably 30, 40 years before Jeff Bezos, drove his car out to Oregon. Those kinds of things. There's a lot of unknown variables that fall into place, right? That's the difference between success and not so successful. And so I think, again, we have to be careful not to covet, right, what
Right.
somebody else has, and then in a sense not feel jealous. But I do think the Scripture, and again, this is my opinion, points to the fact, as the Apostle Paul brings, work is good. See, this goes back to my sense of creativity.
Sure.
God worked and rested, right? through His creation, it's important for us to find something to do. So maybe we have to find what our skill set is. And for some of us, it might be what others might consider menial. And this is one of the things I try to reinforce with my students. There is no bad job. You walk into this campus building, and I'll tell you, the people that actually are providing a better environment for you, student, Michael, when you were a student, than your professor, are the people that clean the restrooms, sweep the floors, dust the hall, whatever. Man, can you imagine what that place would be like, any of those buildings, if they weren't maintained?
Right. Yeah.
And yet we sometimes look down on, and I think that's abhorrent. Every job is worth it. That person is worthy of our praise, if they're doing a good job, and we should encourage that. And I think we have a mental attitude now that somehow, and I understand, I've got, don't you like the terminal degree, whatever that means, in my field, but as I always tell students, I'm simply a farm boy from Indiana. So, and I think, does that mean that I don't have a proud moment? Usually when I'm a better driver than everybody else on the road. That's my proud moment, right?
That's right.
That also leads to my sometimes slip up, maybe more than sometimes slip on language, So I have things I have to work on,
as we all do. I guess, and finally, as a closing question, I've said this to my congregation, and I didn't actually consult you with this, so forgive me if this is somewhat offensive. But
no, that's okay. Offend me.
Yeah, I've told my church that I said there is really inherently nothing Christian about the American dream. I said there's not nothing non-Christian about the American dream. I said, but I think it's just my opinion that it has certainly become an idol for a lot of Christians in this nation because we happen to be Christians in this nation, that we feel somehow entitled to it. And one of the sermons I gave a couple weeks ago was speaking to this frustration that people have where they just don't think they need to be where they're at, and when it comes to their jobs, the working. Most of my congregants are retired, but I was speaking to the working folks of saying, why does God have me here? I'm just waiting for that promotion. I want to be able to take climb the proverbial corporate ladder. And I said, have we considered that the reason why you're not going to get that is because if we remember our purpose here on the planet is to only serve God and live out the Great Commission. That's our humanity's purpose.
Right.
And throughout these other means, that's how we can help achieve those things. I said, but what if God says you're going to best serve people right where you're at, so you're not going to get that promotion? And there was just a little bit of staring off into the wilderness of thinking maybe I've never considered that because it's all about me.
Right.
It's all about, well, I deserve this. And I said, retirement for some of you, might not be working for 40, 45 years, getting your pension or cashing out your distributions through your annuity or your 401k that you built up, and then being on the golf course or being on the lake all the time. I said, that is a very idealized version of what you're quote-unquote supposed to do. I said, but there's nothing guaranteed to us about that. So
absolutely.
But I said that's not necessarily a bad thing because I can't judge where God's going to take you. But I said to worship this idea that I'm somehow owed this, or that I'm going to retire here, or the Americana of it all owes this to me. I find something that we don't discuss that aspect of quote unquote the American dream because look at the amount of you're a student of history. I mean, we're the most privileged society that's ever lived.
Sure.
And so for our 281-year existence, we're the most powerful people, most privileged people, and yet we still find ways to feel entitled and complain. Now, I don't, because of freedom, I think through economics and enterprise, and I think all of those are tied in, which I believe in. I don't want those to go away. But I think you said it earlier, where's our motive? So what do you think, where do you think things go wrong for Christians with the American dream? Do you think we worship it? Do you think it's an idol sometimes?
Well, I do, and I guess that's a struggle that I have because in terms of trying to reconcile because those two things, we're to be good stewards and to be good servants, and at the same time, some of the techniques, we have to be very careful with the techniques because we're encouraging people to acquire things that they don't need. I don't think there's anything wrong with, I want to have thus and so.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
And I think, and again, I go back to the two sides. I mean, by me wanting something, um, and then purchasing it, I've actually given people employment.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
So now, I'm reading a book now about this whole idea of motivations, and we won't get into that. But I mean, so if our if good comes from basically selfish motivations, do we get credit for that or not?
Yeah.
But we'll save that for about 10 years from now. But I'm reading a book on that right now, but I think we have to be cautious. What does it mean to be a good steward? God has given me and you and others this set of assets, talents, or whatever, and said, use these to further my kingdom. What does that mean?
What does that look like?
And
Yeah.
what does that look like? And so I think we have to constantly come back around and ask that question. I have come to really question, this will probably rile some of your audience. You ready? You want to rile me?
Absolutely, please.
Whether or not retirement is a biblical image or not.
Yeah.
Now, I do think extended family is, and I do think if people, need care and concern, and by retirement I mean where we get to the point, because I'm past retirement age, right? I mean, and I like I tell the students, I hope you'll have to drag me out of here by my feet.
Yeah. You don't look a day over 90. So
exactly. I don't feel a day over 120. but and I used to think, yeah, let's save up a lot of money, then I can travel and do it. Now,
Yep.
granted, for some of it, my business allowed me to, right, the roles
Sure,
I had. So
sure.
I got to do the travel. I got to have a very lavish expense by any standard. I mean, I didn't blow a lot of money, but still, by most of the world's standards. So maybe that desire got sated through that experience, but at the same time, there's statistics that show that people who just don't do anything. Now, I'm not saying you don't say, okay, I'm done with this job. I've been at it 40 years. I want to hang up my hat at this job.
Yeah.
But then to just go home and sit.
That's it.
And sit.
And that's a lot of people.
Right. And the death rate, I do believe, and again, I don't have a site, but I feel like I read that oftentimes those folks, life expectancy is actually reduced as opposed to whether or not they're volunteering at church or volunteering with children or volunteering, at soup kitchens or volunteering to clean up a park, doing something in community, even after, quote, they've retired, again, air quotes, meaning they're not making an income, but they are giving of themselves.
Sure.
And maybe that's the key. We give of ourselves in our employment. We give of ourselves, when we're studying. Yes, we're getting back. And then ultimately, if we don't want to and can't make further income, but we're living off savings or whatever, what are we doing?
Yeah.
In giving? So it goes. There's something in some book about that. It begins with a B about giving. I don't remember the name of it.
Yeah. Well, I think we can find that and link it somewhere.
Yeah,
I wonder
okay.
if it's still in print.
Yeah.
But you're talking about motive, and again, that's sacrificial love.
Absolutely.
Which is the pinnacle of the gospel. I mean,
Sure.
There's nothing we can do through except for God's grace.
So should we stand agape at agape then? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think.
I'm sorry, I just had
that's fine. No, but I think that's the end of it, and that's a good. I think that's a good stopping point because there's really nothing else more to be said other than that.
Right.
When it comes to what's required of us, again, motive, but yeah, there's a difference between you giving up a career that's given you income. And now because you were a good steward of that, you're able to support yourself financially and the other family members. And now you can give your time to giving back through all those volunteerism opportunities.
Yes, absolutely.
That's not so. The idea of retirement, I guess I'll clarify that is again, it's the self-indulgence of I've given over here. Now I'm going to give everything to myself. And this is my time now. I deserve this, so I'm gonna, like I said, I'm gonna go to golf. I'm gonna golf every day. I'm gonna go on the lake every day. Don't ask me for anything because I'm retired.
Right.
And that's what I grew up with. That's what I grew up hearing that's what was gonna happen. You go to school, you go to college, you get a job, you work for 40 years, and if you can survive and you have time, you can retire, and then you can't. Basically, you don't have fun when you have kids, and then they're finally out of the house. You're in
Well,
middle
that
age.
part's
And,
true.
yeah,
No.
yeah. You get out, and then you can have fun finally if you make it to
Sure.
retirement age. And I'm thinking, I don't know if that's where I'm trying to think. I'm trying to read through Old Testament, New
Right.
Testament. Like, where is that? Where is that biblical at? Because that seems a lot about me.
Well,
And then when
absolutely.
things don't go my way, it's like, well, God, why would you do any different? Why would you ask anything else of me?
Sure.
It's like we never even consider the fact that, like, no, like I have more for you after this.
So, and I know we probably ought to wrap up here in a minute or two, but do you think that um, whose responsibility is? Well, I don't think the government has a responsibility to do much of it. They take on a lot, but church and parents to help develop a worldview within their children. We never talked. My mother and dad did that for me, but they wouldn't use the term worldview, right? I mean,
Sure.
but I think I see, again, these worldly desires. It's like I want to live for today, and I think there's something in the scripture about that. Uh, as opposed to, I am on a journey, and if I grant my acknowledgement of God, and again, Jesus is King, I'm being prepared for something. I don't even know what it is. And I was talking, I'm on a search committee for a pastor at our parish, and I was talking to the warden. That's the head of the, not okay. I keep mixing all these old, I'm sorry about the Anglican terms. I'm basically a
It's fun.
Protestant.
I love it.
But and I said, but look at the call, because we're going to have to step out on faith, as is this person we think we're going to call. And I said, but look at Abraham, or look at David. I mean, they didn't see the future. I mean, we have the advantage of sitting here and looking, well, look, oh, it had been easy for Abraham. God said, well, I'm going to, bless you to the stars, and you and Sarah, you're old, but you're going to have kids, and they're sitting there when they first heard this story. It had to have been the most crazy thing they had ever heard, or David becoming king, and we see from the armchair quarterbacking, looking back on the replays, right? And our lives, you see, are we're not David, we're not Abraham, we're not Sarah, but our trajectory is very similar, right? We don't know the outcome. All we can do is be faithful.
Yeah.
That God loves us, and as we respond to Him in turn with our allegiance and loyalty, that there is a good end to all this, And I'm not complaining, man. I've had a wonderful, but have I had my upsets? Yes, but I mean, but overall, as I look back, I can see God's hand in my life.
Yeah.
But I think that helps. What's helped is maturing this worldview, if you will. So, anyway.
Yeah, I think the church is. I mean, Proverbs talks about this. I mean, of course, I say this
Yes.
now at the end, but I mean, it says in its very early chapters that God grants people wealth, but it doesn't give them the ability to enjoy them. Instead, somebody else enjoys it. And then he says, but to some, He does give them that, and then he says that it's up to us. And frankly, it's the fact that we get to enjoy those labors
Sure.
because it's something that God has blessed. But yeah, I think it's a systemic failure on the church to educate. I think pastors have entertained and they haven't educated, and therefore, when you're not educating parents, when you're not having versions of Sunday school or
Sure.
catechism in the Catholic Church, and you're teaching them this is what we believe and why we
Right.
believe it.
Right.
It's that contrast, showing that contrast. Then we those parents who go home and talk to their children, and they hear their children's stories, hear their complaints, and there's no counter narrative there to say, hey, well, mom and dad, I've been learning this because pastor
Sure.
this or teacher
Sure.
this, and here's what we believe on this subject, and it's because we are reading our Bibles, we're praying, we're fasting as a church, and I was educated in church about this very thing, and here, let me pass it on to my child. So that is something that I think has been a systemic failure the last 30 years, is that we've completely gone away
Sure.
with the massive successes of church is actual qualified teaching in the church.
Yep.
But that's something that I hope, with my little church, what I can control, that these things that we're talking about are values that will be instilled, even in
Good.
even in an aging congregation,
Sure.
that we have something to pass on. So, I gotta thank you so much for your time.
Well, it's
Really
been my
appreciate.
pleasure. Thank you very much, Michael.
Yeah.
So,
And is there anywhere that people, if they want to look you up or find you or get connected with any of your entrepreneurship, is there anywhere
well, sure.
people
I
should
mean,
go?
I can give you my I have an email address that goes to my consulting business. I'm not I don't you don't and they can just contact me there rather than contacting me at the university. I don't mind if they contact me at the university, but which do you think you'd prefer in a way of an email address?
Oh well, though that's for listeners. Is there like if a listener had like they wanted to
Well, that's
connect
what I
with you
mean.
more?
The
Yeah.
easiest way to do that is at allen.knight, ALLEN .KNIGHT ampersand at eaknightconsulting.com.
Excellent. Ellen.Knight at eaknightconsulting.com.
Right.
Excellent. So
So,
that's if people have any feedback or they have any questions or they just want to
oh yeah, if they want to
just pick your brain a little bit.
lash out,
Oh yes, please.
can't believe you said
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
What do you know? And
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I
very much.
appreciate your time, Alan. I hope you have a good rest of your evening. All
Oh,
right.
absolute. Thank you, and we'll look forward. Maybe we can sit down again and chat, Michael.
I hope so, unless they start throwing things at me.
Okay.
In the comment section.
Absolutely. Very good.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you so much again to Dr. Knight and his wonderful insight and experience in the realms of business and entrepreneurship. I really appreciate his perspective. Feel free to connect with him at the email he just gave if you have any questions or recommendations or just some insight into the realm of business entrepreneurship and how that intersects with Christianity and how that affects our spiritual lives. I think he is a great reference for all of you. Thank you to him and his time. Thank you for listening to this podcast. As always, I appreciate all your support and your feedback. Feel free to connect with us on all the social media platforms we discuss every week on Facebook, YouTube, and through our email, wsnspodcast@gmail.com. Appreciate y'all. May God bless you and may God keep you.